Hey everybody, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Glad you're here. Fun show coming up. Seth Emerson, update on everything happening at Georgia spring practice. We'll begin our show, though, with a couple of updates on a couple of Georgia's rising sophomores, both who expect to have big roles for Georgia this season and both who seem to be fitting in pretty well so far. We'll tell you all about it next as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
If you talk to people outside the bubble of DawgNation, one of the things that they will say a lot is, boy, Georgia has got a lot to replace off the 2017 team. If Dogs hope to be good this upcoming season, they're going to have to find a whole bunch of people to sort of step up and do what some of the seniors and departed players in the 2017 team were able to do. And that's a legitimate point, legitimate question. It's something we've obviously spent a good bit of time talking about here on DawgNation Daily. When you sort of address the issues facing Georgia for this upcoming season, you definitely face that as one of the big issues. But in terms of some of the central figures who kind of fill in those gaps and sort of fill those voids and prepare to take on a larger role the upcoming season, for some of these guys within the, as I say, the sort of bubble of DawgNation, within the sort of sphere of people who pay the closest attention to this program, there are, just some guys who generate a lot of confidence in their ability to sort of step in to the next phase of their career and step up much the way that guys like Nick Chubb and Sony Michel did a year ago. An example of that is rising sophomore running back DeAndre Swift. This is a running back who Georgia fans, despite the fact that I guess by sort of blunt description, he was the third-string running back a year ago. This is a guy that Georgia fans have a lot of confidence in. Dog fans just believe that he's good, and that feeling has existed around the Georgia program for quite some time. Go back to September, even way back then at the beginning of last season, Kirby Smart sort of already knew that DeAndre Swift was good and capable of being a contributing player. Here's what Kirby Smart said about Swift way back at the beginning of 2017.
He's a very mature kid. He picks it up the first time. He doesn't need 2 reps. He understands the game. He's got great instincts, great hands. I mean, you can put him in the slot. You can put him in the backfield. You can put him on kickoff coverage. You can do anything with the guy, and he kind of gets it. That's why when he was injured earlier in camp, we wanted to get him fixed. We knew he was going to be a player. He didn't need the reps. He needed to be healthy to play.
So that's what Kirby Smart knew in September. That's what a lot of Georgia fans do in September. By the end of the season, virtually everyone was aware of DeAndre Swift's capabilities as a running back. He has the touchdown that puts the game on ice against Auburn in the SEC Championship in Atlanta. You all remember it. My favorite description of it, though, came from Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm, who after the game had sort of the best way of telling the story of how DeAndre Swift did what he was able to do. Here's Jake Fromm from December.
Holy cow. All right, so he was supposed to run to the right. All right, and I take the ball, obviously I give the handoff to him, and he starts taking off to the left. And in my mind, I'm like, man, what are you doing? That joker takes off, and I look, there's a huge hole, and he makes a move on the guy, that joker takes off. That's just awesome. That guy, he didn't run it in the right spot. It doesn't matter. It's the guy making a play. DeAndre Swift, man, go Dogs.
He didn't run it to the right spot, but that doesn't matter. DeAndre Swift, man, go Dogs. What a great description from Jake Fromm. And the description, the sort of unbridled enthusiasm that Fromm has in his voice there when he talks about DeAndre Swift is one of the reasons why so many Georgia fans have confidence in Swift for this upcoming season. As a freshman, maybe he had some, growing pains, some moments where he was learning, and maybe the learning curve at times can be a little bit steep. But boy, when that athleticism was put on full display, that elusiveness, that ability, natural ability, maybe even, to make guys miss, DeAndre Swift just certainly seemed to have that. But here's the thing as we transition to 2018, and maybe a moment where you pump the brakes just a little bit on the sort of unbridled enthusiasm that I was just describing. What DeAndre Swift did in his freshman season of 2017 was, for the most part, a luxury for Georgia. Georgia was already going to have a good running game, even if DeAndre Swift wasn't on the roster. Bringing in Swift, allowing him to do what he did, was a luxury. It's not a necessity. It's something that you were able to just sort of add on to what you already had. But for 2018, he goes from luxury to very much necessity, because the kinds of things that Swift did a year ago as maybe a bit of a surprise, pleasant surprise for Georgia fans, it becomes an expectation for this year to kind of fill in the shoes for guys like Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, who are two of the best running backs that Georgia's ever had. The great news here as this transition takes place from 27 to 2018, though, is there are some people out there, even outside DawgNation and away from the Georgia program, who apparently feel that Swift is going to be more than capable of doing just that in 2018. Let me give you an example here. There was an interesting piece the other day from Adam Rittenberg, who's a writer for ESPN.com, looking at the future of college football offenses. And over the course of the next 3 years, which offenses expect to be the best in the sport? Georgia ranked number 1 on Adam Rittenberg's list, and in the description, it's an insider article, but in the description at ESPN.com for why Georgia's going to be so good, one of the names that comes up is DeAndre Swift. And Rittenberg actually gets a quote from a defensive coordinator. We don't know which DC, but it's a coordinator from a team that played Swift in Georgia last year, and what he says, I'm going to read straight from ESPN.com here, that next back is going to be a dude. He hurt us more than the other two. I don't think that's going to fall off very much, and then they have Zamir White coming in too. So we'll put the Zamir White conversation aside for a moment because obviously Georgia fans are excited about that. But take a listen to that quote there from that defensive coordinator saying the drop-off from two all-time greats like Nick Chubb and Sony Michel to DeAndre Swift, I don't think it's going to be all that significant. Now, does this coach really, we don't know who he is, so he's not going to be held to his opinion. Is there a certain amount of puffery to all this? I guess there could be, but it does sort of fit into the conversation about the optimism that a lot of Georgia fans already have about what DeAndre Swift's going to be able to do in 2018, and it's probably nice to have that feeling validated by someone outside the Georgia program and someone apparently, according to ESPN, who had to game plan against DeAndre Swift a season ago. But one important sort of addition and addendum to this conversation. When it comes to filling in for Nick Chubb and Sony Michel being as good as Chubb and Michel were a year ago, Kirby Smart's also quick to remind all of us this is more than just about your running back skills. Being a good running back at Georgia is about more than just being a running back. Here's how Kirby Smart recently described all of that.
Well, the great thing is we got to see two of those guys get a ton of work last year in the spring, where you guys might not have got to see them get a ton of work because you saw the two studs out there carrying it all the time. We got to see a lot of that. So we get to see DeAndre jump into that battle, that fray with those two. We get to find out a lot about who's going to be the competitor on special teams, who can replace 127 snaps Sony took on special teams. Because right now, none of those three have stepped up to the plate to say, I can be as valuable a special teamer as Sony was. Nick Chubb took every single rep last spring in special teams in two different phases. Now, we didn't use him in the season because we didn't have to. But who of those three is going to say, I can lead this spot, I can contribute on special teams, I can do every pickup right, I can protect the ball right, and I can go out and affect the rest of the team by the energy and attitude I practice with. That's what I want to see. I want to see which one of them is going to go to class the most, which one's going to have the highest GPA, because there's a great battle there, and we can certainly use all three of them, and hopefully we'll get to use Zamir and James Cook as well when they're healthy and they can go.
So important reminder from Kirby Smart, hey, good running backs, let's compare you how you play as a running back, but also go to class, get a good GPA, contribute on special teams, be a leader. That's sort of the overarching idea, unspoken from Kirby Smart there, but that really seems to matter, and that's an important sort of point to add on to this conversation. But the overall bottom line is sort of back to the original point. Is Georgia going to have the best offense in college football for the next 3 years? I really don't know about that. When I look ahead to the future of the Georgia offense, I'm kind of like what Jeff Sintel said on Tuesday on DawgNation Daily, that it may be more about the wide receivers that Georgia's adding in the class of 2019, Jaden Hazelwood and Dominic Blaylock, that determines just how good this offense is going to be in years to come. I think that Jeff might be right about that. In sort of the immediate, I'm more worried about the present state of Georgia football for 2018 and how DeAndre Swift does fit into the role of lead running back this season. I think my overall opinion is probably pretty similar to the defensive coordinator who was quoted by ESPN. I think Georgia's going to be just fine at that position. DeAndre Swift alone, I think, gives Georgia a chance to have a formidable running game. But when you add in the potential freshmen that Kirby Smart just alluded to, like a injury-recovered Zamir White or a hotshot young freshman like James Cook, could be fun watching this Georgia running game in 2018. Different names than the country remembers from 2017, but maybe productivity that's not altogether all that different. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. So glad you are with us. No matter how you may be getting our show, you're watching us on video, 10 a.m. on the DawgNation Facebook or YouTube pages. We appreciate you checking out the video. On the radio at noon with our friends in Athens on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. By the way, 960 The Ref getting ready for a big Georgia baseball game later on this afternoon. Georgia hosting Texas A&M, a hot Aggies team after Georgia has been hot to start the season as well. Check that out on 960 The Ref later on this evening and then on Friday and Saturday as well for Georgia baseball on there. And, of course, we're also available for you in podcast form, Apple Podcasts, Android devices. We post the show at the world-famous DawgNation.com. Some of you listen on SoundCloud. We're just glad you have found DawgNation Daily here today and want to remind you, while I've got your attention, you are coming up on Sunday, Easter, huge day in my family. I've got 2 young kids. They're excited about the Easter egg hunts. Mama's excited about getting them dressed up for church. So we're all ready to go for a big Easter weekend. And when you think about your own big Easter weekend, think about the Easter hopping deals at Kroger. You can save big with Easter deals at Kroger on Easter candy, baskets, gifts, and more at your local Atlanta Kroger stores. I know in our house it's always a big deal to sort of go back through the basement and see if we can find last year's Easter basket. About half the time we can, about half the time we can't. So it's nice to know that Kroger's got some good deals on that to get you stocked up for everything you need for your Easter this weekend. And whatever you're doing, hope you enjoy it and have a happy time there. We'll have a happy time ourselves here on DawgNation Daily in just a couple of minutes when we get ready to welcome in Seth Emerson, who's been all over the ongoing proceedings at Georgia spring practice. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Before that, though, start the show by talking about a rising sophomore, one of the heralded members of Georgia's 2017 recruiting class in DeAndre Swift. Let me transition and speak about another one here for a moment. The offensive lineman, Andrew Thomas, who was rock solid as right tackle a year ago, has made the move here this spring over to left tackle, and so far, everything seems to be fine, at least according to the description from Georgia coach Kirby Smart. Here is what Kirby recently had to say about Thomas.
I probably hadn't paid close attention to it as much as I should. That's hard to say in shorts, and today being the first day in pads, I do know this. If you don't notice him, it's probably a good thing. It's not like there's popping up sacks and things. I mean, it's very quiet. It's like, okay, there's not a lot of issues over there. We hadn't got a lot of pass rush off that side. He's made the transition well.
I love that description. It's Major League Baseball season starting today. We sort of say the same thing about umpires from time to time. If you know the umpire's name, if you notice him during a game, something's probably going wrong. And for Andrew Thomas at left tackle, it's kind of the same thing. He's more of a utility than some sort of pizzazz type guy, but he's holding his own there at left tackle, and that's not some small feat for a rising sophomore to already be a solid left tackle protecting the blind side of Jake Fromm. That's kind of an exciting thing to think about. And for Kirby Smart, he gives a lot of the credit for the transition of Andrew Thomas to his position coach, Sam Pittman, a guy that Georgia fans already like. The work with Thomas may be more reason for Pittman to become popular. Here's a little more from Kirby.
I think Coach Pittman has done a good job leading up to this of walkthroughs, knowledge. We had bowl practices where we just worked on us, and he flipped over and played 2 or 3 practices. So it's not foreign to him. He's done a tremendous job.
Yeah, he's done a tremendous job. Sam Pittman, by all indications, is a tremendous offensive line coach. And one of the things that you see here is another example of Andrew Thomas himself has talked to us about here on DawgNation. You may remember a couple of years ago, he was a part of one of our Marlowe's broadcasts before he enrolled at Georgia, before he became a member of the Georgia team. And it's one of the reasons why I love doing these Marlowe's broadcasts leading up to the National Signing Day. We get a chance to learn more about these guys, find out who they are. And one of the things we found out about Andrew Thomas is even before he arrived at Georgia, he took his relationship with Sam Pittman very seriously. It was something that was important to him. The bond they've created is helping him now, but that bond started even before Thomas enrolled at Georgia. Here's how Andrew Thomas explained this to us a couple of years ago.
See, when I first met him, he was at Arkansas. That's when I first met him. He came down to meet me, and as you guys know, I have really long arms, and he came down, and we were standing on the basketball court, and he was like, boy, you can reach down to the bottom of the court from right here with those long arms. And every time I come up to go see him, he's just a great coach, and I try not to get caught up into, how many guys he's got into the league. I try to pay attention to, his relationship with the players. I talked to some of his players, and, you can tell that he really cares for his players and not just about football, but as your development as a young man.
You love to hear that. Thomas liking Pittman, Kirby liking the way that Pittman's helping Thomas. He's becoming a left tackle and a really good one, and I think the real strength of this Georgia team, with all due respect to Jim Chaney and Mel Tucker, who I think are probably top-flight coordinators, but the real strength of this Georgia coaching staff are its position coaches. Pittman may be the highest among the entire group there, just a guy that creates a bond, creates a relationship, and then utilizes that relationship to get the most out of these guys as players. You love the way this is playing out right now with Andrew Thomas. But with Kirby Smart, there's always always room to improve. There's always a place to get better. And when it comes to Andrew Thomas, who's doing a great job at that left tackle position, the next realm for him, the next frontier, is to now also step up and be a leader. I like this challenge from Kirby to Andrew Thomas. I think Georgia fans will like it too.
The challenge for Andrew is, can he become a vocal leader, not just a leader by example? He's got to learn to push other guys and challenge other guys along with Lamont. And I think he can be that kind of impact leader.
The Lamont you hear referenced there is obviously Lamont Gilliard, the Georgia center, who Kirby had praised also for being a leader so far during spring practice. And when you hear the audio clip of Andrew Thomas that we just heard a moment ago, I think that it's not too much of a stretch to assume that he one day probably will be that vocal leader at Georgia. He's certainly a guy comfortable speaking to the media. He's been comfortable, in terms of, how he addresses us and the times he's got a chance to speak to the media. So seeing Andrew Thomas grow into that role as a Georgia leader, that's not a hard thing for me to imagine, and I guess over the next couple of years we'll see him do indeed that. We may even see that as soon as this season some. So interesting stuff from Kirby Smart there. Good to have you with us here on DawgNation Daily. For more on what's been happening at Georgia spring practice, let's check in with Seth Emerson right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Always really appreciate Seth Emerson here on DawgNation Daily. And Seth, let me start with a sort of backtracking on what has been a little bit of bad news for Georgia during the spring practice. That was what Devad Wilson said himself on Twitter before he deleted the tweet, was a torn ACL. Before the injury for Wilson had happened, you had really seen enough from him to kind of mention him in one of your practice notes, that he was a freshman that had impressed you in the brief window of time that you get to watch practice. How big of a loss do you think it is for Georgia to have this incoming freshman not available, I'm going to presume, for the 2018 season, given the fact that he'd already impressed some during his first few spring practices?
Well, it's hard to say until we get into the season and see how much he might have played. With Tyson Campbell coming in August, that's a guy that, he may have the potential to play right away. Right now, obviously, they feel really good about one cornerback spot with DeAndre Baker. And I would venture to say with both safety spots, with Jared Reed and Richard LeCount probably kind of penciled in at that other spot, if not penned in. It's really the star and the other cornerback spot. And Tyreek McGee's a guy who's been a little bit kind of in the mix both of his first 2 years, especially last year, and did start for a stretch last year before Malcolm Parrish came back and got that spot back. So McGee kind of has that other second cornerback spot. Devad Wilson was just playing well enough and had made enough of a good impression. I think it was Jonathan Ledbetter mentioned him when he was asked about the early enrollees, that he was a guy that you said, well, that guy could push for something. So it'll kind of depend on when we get to the season and we say, all right, how good is Tyreek McGee if he does win the other cornerback spot, and how much could someone have helped at that star position? I think right now Devad Wilson was someone who was at least on the 2 deep, but not sure about how much higher up.
And I am doing the math on this correctly, right? I mean, the chances of Wilson playing in 2018 are essentially zero, correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you tear an ACL in March, they like to say 6 months, but I mean, that's overly optimistic. That's the early end. So yeah, I mean, I would foresee a redshirt.
And then you mentioned Tyson Campbell a moment ago. I think I asked Chip about this on Monday. I guess I'll ask you the same question. I think that Georgia probably would like to have some new blood inserted into its secondary, if nothing else, just for competition's sake at practice. Maybe a little more pressure now on Tyson Campbell this summer to kind of come in and be ready to go, given the fact that they're already down one member of the group there?
I don't know if pressure is the right word. Like I said, Tyreek McGee may end up solidifying that number 2 spot, and then it's a matter of the star. And I will say they are working a lot of people at the star in practice, and the different positions, cornerbacks, safeties, outside linebackers, even inside linebackers. And that's going to depend a lot on type of teams they're playing. But for instance, when they play Missouri in week 4, they're going to need that star to be a defensive back, for sure.
Yeah.
Because of the way they play, and some other offenses they play too, particularly when they play a pocket quarterback. I mean, they don't have Lorenzo Carter anymore to kind of stretch out there and be kind of on Lorenzo Island, like they used to say. Maybe Walter Grant can end up doing that. Maybe DeAndre Walker can do that, but there might be more of an emphasis on getting a bunch of D-backs out there. So, yeah, but they do have some guys. I mean, it depends on what happens this spring. Does Amir Speed emerge? He's a guy we'd heard some buzz about. They signed enough guys, but Tyson Campbell will come in, and if he's good enough to play, if he's good enough as the accolades and the buzz has been about him, then I think they'll find a place for him.
Speaking of practice observations, you had written the other day about the energy that you'd seen from Dan Lanning, the new outside linebackers coach. I'm curious, I didn't really know a lot about Cortez Hankton before he was hired. Have you seen enough from him during practice to sort of form any kind of observation or opinion on him, much the same way you were able to write about Lanning the other day?
Well, he's very kind of maybe in talking with Nicole Hardman the other day about him, it is evident there's kind of a difference between him and James Coley, and that Coley, had not been purely a receivers coach. His background was more kind of as a quarterback coach. That was his first job, and then he kind of bounced around. He was the quarterbacks coach and offensive coordinator at Miami before Rick arrived. So when he took over the receivers, it's not that he didn't know how to coach receivers. I think he'd done it at one previous spot, but Hankton comes in, and that's all he's done. I mean, he played it in college. He played it in the NFL, which obviously right away makes an impression on receivers. One thing Nicole mentioned was, he knows what it takes to get to the NFL, and he's trying to teach us that. So it's probably a little bit reminiscent of when Tony Ball was here, where you've got a coach who's very cerebral, very technical, and they're going to be doing a lot of things that are along those lines. Just very, very kind of technical. That's what I can tell so far.
You made an interesting point in one of your pieces at DawgNation the other day about Jim Chaney coaching the tight ends, and there was some sort of tongue-in-cheek stuff from guys like Charlie Warner about maybe getting a little bit more attention, given the fact that the offensive coordinator is now working with the tight ends. That's, I think, a really interesting point to bring up, but how realistic or true is it that Chaney's work with them during practice might also lead to more catches during the game? Is that something that you're going to be paying attention to here this fall, that maybe that does lead to some more catches?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jim Chaney's number one goal is for the offense to work. So I'm not sure he's going to be sitting there going, all right, we've got to get the tight ends the ball. On the other hand, by working with the tight ends more, he maybe will say, well, Isaac's doing this really well in practice. Charlie seems to be doing this really well in practice. Maybe we'll practice this a little bit more. Maybe we'll incorporate this into the game plan a little bit more. It's something that could be interesting to watch, and if the tight ends do end up getting the ball more this year, then people are going to have a hard time not tying it specifically to that. So, yeah, it's something that is definitely worth watching, I guess especially from Nauta and Warner. Those are the two you look at. Jackson Harris, he's done some nice things since he's been here, but he's been kind of more in that blocking back kind of mold. You've got John Fitzpatrick and the other guy whose name escapes me who are coming in. They'll be freshmen. But Nauta and Warner, guys that have shown that they can be kind of X factors in the pass game at tight end, and it would certainly benefit Georgia to get them involved a little bit more. On the other hand, with the way Georgia played last year and the success they had on offense, it was really nitpicking to say, well, why aren't they throwing to the tight end more? Well, they're winning. They were just fine. But this year, the other thing that may benefit the tight ends is Sony Michel and Nick Chubb aren't around anymore.
Yeah.
I think the passing game is going to have to carry a little bit more of a load. And Michel was already involved in the passing game. I mean, I could see, I would imagine DeAndre Swift will end up getting a lot of those kind of out of the backfield pass plays that Sony Michel tended to get. But, maybe in a way that just kind of redistributes passes to another position, and the tight ends benefit.
I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this because I'm not by any means an X's and O's expert, but there is a school of thought out there that if you look at college teams whose sort of fourth receiving option is a tight end compared to, like, say, another slot receiver like most of the Big 12 teams kind of do, that the tight end teams are in general more successful. Some people would say that means just having a tight end on the field is valuable even if he's not used. You do your second look piece after every single game. I mean, do you think there's a school of thought to that when you have a talented potentially physical tight end like a Nada or a Warner, that he actually still has value for Georgia, even if you're not throwing it to him, because he is a blocker and something that defensive coordinators have to think about? I mean, do these guys have value to Georgia even when they're not catching the football?
Yeah, I would say that school of thought maybe tied more to that if your tight end is an option over that like fourth receiver, then that is tied more to you're in more of a running first offense, and therefore the running physical teams tend to be better over the long haul. I would tie it more to that. I mean, there's obviously more than one way to skin a cat on offense, but I mean, Georgia's tight end usage has obviously gone down in terms of just targets and catches, but from rewatching these games over the last few years, they're on the field as much as they've ever been.
Yeah.
They're not, disappearing. It's like I'm working on a story right now about how the fullback position appears to be just gradually disappearing from Georgia's offense, and especially with Christian Payne being out now, as in he graduated. And they don't have a natural next fullback up to play. What's going to happen with that? But tight ends are on the field for the Georgia offense pretty consistently, often two times. Sometimes they threw a third one out there. They're on the field. They use them. They just don't get targeted as much for passes as they used to.
Kirby Smart complimented the third-string quarterback Stetson Bennett the other day, and this kind of stuff pops up from time to time. It happened in the build-up to the Oklahoma game, the work that Bennett had done kind of as the pretend version of Baker Mayfield. It happens enough that this sort of feels a little bit more than just the typical spring puffery of everybody's great and everyone's going to be phenomenal. It sounds like Georgia has themselves a pretty interesting third-string quarterback. Is that kind of your read on this situation too?
Yeah, but let's make no mistake, he's the third stringer.
Sure, of course.
There's a big gap between Justin Fields and Stetson Bennett at this point. But Stetson Bennett, amid all these walk-ons, because he's not the only one there. Sam Vaughn, I think, is still out there. John Cedar is another guy who also very quietly mimicked the other team's quarterback and did mimic Baker Mayfield last year in the Rose Bowl, but Stetson Bennett got more notice. And they've added another one who's another kind of tall quarterback whose name escapes me. But amid all these walk-ons, like Stetson Bennett has put some gap between himself and the other guys. But he is, if you go out there to practice, let's say there's also a very noticeable height difference between him and, look, if something happens to Jake Fromm and then Justin Fields, I think Stetson Bennett will be the next guy out there. I also think Georgia will be, they'll have to be ready.
Right.
And I think he could do some things, but let's also not go crazy. I foresee a Justin Fields package if Jake Fromm is definitely the starter this year. I'm not sure we're at the point where we should say there's going to be a Stetson Bennett package.
I joked around on yesterday's show. I kind of had some fun with the fact that Kirby Smart is treating his defense, at least in the early going of spring practice, a little different than I expected. He hammered that group all spring last year, getting pounded by the offense, pushed around, everything he said, challenged them to dominate. There was a lot of that from Kirby last spring. I assume we'd hear a lot of that this spring, given everybody that has to be replaced in the 2017 defense, but he sort of described it as being ahead of where the group was, at least in the early going last spring. You believe him when he says that? Were you also a little surprised that Kirby was maybe a little bit more complimentary than he was a season ago? What did you make of what Kirby said about the defense on Saturday?
Remind me what he said.
Well, he said that they were ahead of where they had been a year ago, and he said, y'all don't believe me when I say this, but they were really getting pushed around last spring, and basically saying that it had been better in through the first however many practices it had been as of Saturday.
Well, I remember what he said last spring, and we did kind of poo-poo it a little bit, but it did turn out that last year's offense was better, and the O-line was better. So that was more a reflection last year of the offense was going to be better than people anticipated, and that they had made that jump. And the defense may have rested a little bit on its laurels last spring and its experience. I haven't really gotten into. I didn't divine. I was there. at all the Kirby things. I didn't really divine too much yet into what he's saying about this year, and how the offense is going against the defense. I mean, the little stuff like, for one thing, the second group of receivers is ahead of the second group of defensive backs. We were talking earlier about Vod Wilson, where he fit in, Tyson Campbell, and all that. I mean, that is a sign that, beyond the first stringers on each side of the ball, they feel better about the second group of receivers, like, J.J. Holloman, Michael Chigbu, Jason Stanley, et cetera, even Kyrus Jackson in there, versus the second group they've got in the secondary. They're worried a little bit about, I've also taken notice, he talked about, those tailbacks, like, even without Michelle and Chubb there, it appears that guys like Harrion and Holyfield are making plays against the defense. So, I from what I've divined so far, I think that the offense seems a little bit ahead of the defense, and that, frankly, that shouldn't be shocking based on who's back and who's not. But we're just nearing the end of the second week of 5 weeks of spring practice.
If you don't mind, I want to squeeze in one quick final question. I thought what you wrote about DeAndre Walker the other day, speaking of the defense, was fascinating. That big stats last year, maybe those stats came in sort of a situational pass rushing role, and he's got to prove that he can be an every down player the way that Carter and Bellamy were able to prove a year ago. I was hoping you might expound upon that just a little bit for the audience kind of listening in and watching right now, because I thought that was a really interesting point about how a guy that got to the quarterback has now got to prove that he can do even more than that this season.
Yeah, Carter and Bellamy, for everything they did last year, they also subbed out a lot. There were, the secondary doesn't tend to sub. When you had number 3 out there last year, you didn't tend to sub him out very much either. But there were some plays he did come out. But basically, the secondary and the inside linebackers tend to stay on the field. But they subbed. The defense subs a lot, but the outside linebackers did too. And a result of that is DeAndre Walker estimated he ended up playing about 40 to 45% of the team's defensive snaps last year. So when you think about that, it doesn't mean that he got his sacks and tackles for loss, which incredibly were second on the team, both of them. I mean, nobody realizes that because you think Carter and Bellamy. But DeAndre Walker, when he got those 40 to 45% of team snaps, made good use of them. But that is the question now, is we were talking a little earlier about the stuff Lorenzo used to do and putting him on Lorenzo Island, almost kind of playing nickelback star sometimes, and throwing him inside, and Davin Bellamy would do so many things. I mean, they did pass coverage, especially Carter, and they were so integral in the Notre Dame game in having that contained, that took Brandon Wimbush like totally out of his comfort zone, and they would do that. The question is, can DeAndre Walker do that? Is he an every down kind of guy? And we're going to find that out. Is this a guy who is only starting now as a senior because the two guys that were in front of him the whole time, even go back to when Leonard Floyd and Jordan Jenkins were ahead of him his freshman year, were that good? Or, was it because he does have some holes in his game that could be exposed this year? We'll find out.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting piece of analysis. Seth, thanks for your time here on DawgNation Daily. Look forward to reading a bunch from you in the days ahead, and we'll check in with you soon here on DawgNation Daily.
All right, talk to you later.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Really good stuff there from Seth Emerson. I love, Seth takes that time at practice that he gets to observe very seriously, and he's obviously crunching a lot of data, and he presents it well at DawgNation.com. He's a good guy to have on when you want to just sort of get deep into the weeds of what's been going on at Georgia spring practice. It's one of the reasons why I like having him here on DawgNation Daily. I thought that was really good stuff right there. I mentioned Kroger a little earlier in the show, and you're thinking about Kroger for Easter. Well, for your last-minute Easter needs, don't forget that all Kroger stores are going to be open regular hours on Easter. For that sort of last-minute thing, you got to run in and grab. You got to take the covered dish to your grandmother's house or something like that. Well, you got to use Kroger for whatever you need, because they are open regular hours on Easter, and we're glad to know that Kroger's going to be there for us this upcoming holiday season, like they are for every single holiday. We love having Kroger around here on DawgNation Daily. Let me transition to our SEC Through. I will remind you, SEC Country Live, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, this afternoon on both the SEC Country Facebook and YouTube pages. Looking forward to that program. One of the things we talked about yesterday, and we actually didn't mention this on DawgNation Daily until right now, but it's the funny stuff that's been going on with Elijah Holyfield on Twitter, and an Alabama player kind of getting involved on this. Let me start with, some like random football account. They're always like tweeting a bunch of stuff out, open for retweets, looking to grow the brand. NFL Draft Diamonds tweets out this picture of Elijah Holyfield running with the football, and a lot of you have seen this picture on social media. Holyfield just looks massive. It says, meet Evander Holyfield's son Elijah, running back for Georgia. Anyone want to do goal line one-on-ones with him? That's the question that the NFL Draft Diamonds Twitter account puts out. Lindell Mack Wilson, the Alabama linebacker, sees that tweet. His response is, raise his hand in class. He gives you a hand emoji. Wilson's obviously, somewhat challenging Elijah Holyfield here. I think this is all in fun. I really don't have a problem with Mack Wilson doing that. You want competitors in the SEC, and these two guys may get a chance to indeed compete against each other at some point in time. But the funny backstory on all this, though, and a lot of Georgia fans have been talking about this on social media, and I don't know if we still have this tweet to show to our video audience, the sort of side-by-side comparison. Logan Booker is one of our buddies from Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. He's the one that initially had taken the photo of Elijah Holyfield. If you're watching on video, you can see this. If you're listening, I'm going to have to describe it. But a lot of you, even if you're not watching the show right now, have seen this on Twitter. Holyfield's running. The biceps are just, they're just exploding off the image here. But when the SEC Network had taken Logan's photo and put it up for their own purposes, which they decided to sort of Photoshop the biceps and sort of blew them up even bigger, to the point where what was already a cool photo is now this sort of cartoonishly large version of Elijah Holyfield. He legitimately looks like the Incredible Hulk in the Photoshop picture from the SEC Network. So it's all been pretty funny to watch kind of play out. Whatever it takes to sort of pass the time during the spring until the actual season gets back again. So good photo from Logan Booker. It has sort of owned the internet here in a lot of different ways over the last few days. It's going to been kind of funny to kind of watch it play out. Speaking of Alabama, by the way, our buddy Chris Kirchner, who we have on DawgNation Daily before from time to time, reported this week that Alabama signed junior college defensive lineman Tavita Musika. Musika is from California, and you could tell Saban had this on his mind even on National Signing Day. He knew he needed to address that position. I'm assuming Musika is probably going to be the kind of guy that can sort of step in and play. This is probably going to end up being a good addition for Alabama, but junior college add-ons don't always work out the way they're supposed to. I think a lot of folks expected DeMarcus Hayes to maybe start for Georgia last season along the offensive line. That hasn't happened as of yet, so we'll see what kind of impact Musika is able to make for Alabama. I thought it was kind of funny. You saw more examples yesterday of Florida trying to sort of hype up its new strength and conditioning program led by Nick Savage. Savage is probably a pretty good strength and conditioning coach. I guess I'm skeptical of how quickly it can all change. One of the former Gator defensive linemen at Florida for a pro day was talking about how everybody used to be doughboys around the program. Now they're all swole, and I don't know. Maybe this is true. Certainly, upgrading strength and conditioning probably was important for Florida. We heard how much Jim McElwain had let that wane over the course of his time there with the Gators. I just am skeptical of how things can change quickly. I think you probably saw more from Scott Sinclair at Georgia in 2017 than you did in 2016 because, listen, results in the weight room just don't happen overnight. So I'm a little skeptical of that narrative, but I'm also a Gator hater, so maybe take that with a grain of salt. I thought that Casey Clausen, the former Tennessee quarterback, had an interesting statement to our Alex Martin Smith from SEC Country in talking about what it takes to get Tennessee back to the top. His suggestion to Jeremy Pruitt is, how about you recruit nationally more? That's what Tennessee used to do back in the glory days. He thinks they should be doing that again. I understand Clausen's idea on this. I think it's just tough to replicate national recruiting year over year. In-state, in-region recruiting is just the easiest thing to do. Tough at Tennessee because there's not a lot of in-state talent, but still probably pretty important, and we'll make that your SEC through. All right, wrapping up here today, a couple things. First of all, Gator Hater Countdown. Y'all know we hate the Gators here, and we don't believe they're that much stronger than they were a year ago, and they're certainly not going to be strong enough to take care of Georgia coming up this October in our world's largest outdoor cocktail party renewal, and that's why 212 days from right now, we think Georgia goes back to Jacksonville and gets another win over the Florida Gators. We'll call it our Gator Hater Countdown here on DawgNation Daily. Also, big edition of the DawgNation Daily Double coming up later on today. You can find it at forum.dawgnation.com. We'll also put a link to it when we post the show at our show page at DawgNation.com. Georgia actually starts a very big baseball series today. Georgia's been hot, top team in the SEC along with Vanderbilt so far, but the SEC wins have come against mostly last place competition, South Carolina and Alabama. Begin a series hosting Texas A&M today. That should be interesting to check out. We'll talk about the DawgNation Daily Double and see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily. All right, and on video, we got some time for some comments. We'll try to knock some of those out. We appreciate you being with us. I got chastised on the YouTube page yesterday on SEC Country Live for not spending enough time on YouTube. So let me start on the YouTube page here for DawgNation Daily today. Anthony Wigley, going back to that picture of Elijah Holyfield, says, people sleep on my boy Holyfield. He's a beast. First of all, he really is. Go back and rewatch the Notre Dame game, and I know a lot of you remember this. There was the one kick return that got called back because of penalty, but that doesn't mean that Holyfield was any less impressive. I mean, yeah, I just think he's good. And, you know, the one thing I said a lot last summer was that people were trying to figure out who the running back left out was going to be. And I said, don't be too quick to assume that you know who the sort of fifth guy is in this Georgia rotation. Yes, when you have 5 scholarship running backs, and Georgia always wants to have at least 5, but when you have 5, someone is going to be on the outside looking in. Just don't be too quick to assume that we know who it is. You know, the notion that Elijah Holyfield could still be a star, I think he still could be. Now, am I betting on him over Zamir White? Probably not. Am I betting on him over DeAndre Swift? With all due respect to Holyfield, I'm probably still taking Swift and White over Holyfield. Am I betting that Elijah Holyfield can still be pretty dadgum good? Yeah, I really do think that he can be. And then Dapper Dan says Brian Harrien's going to get his. Yo, I think Harrien is good. There is nothing stranger to me when, and this is just my own ego, but I'm going to be honest with you. When a guy that I didn't think much of plays, and you have to, and you're thinking about it, you watch it, and you're like, wait a second, did I just see what I thought I saw? Because when Georgia added Brian Harrien before the 2016 season, I'd never heard of him. I had no idea who Brian Harrien was. And then he played against North Carolina, and it was already sort of weird that he was playing over Holyfield anyway. Holyfield had the injury, but I believe he was healthy enough. Am I wrong about this? That he was cleared to play for that North Carolina game? Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think I'm right about that. But nonetheless, Harrien played against North Carolina, and he was good. He was getting yards. He looked like an SEC running back, and you have to sort of recalibrate your expectations of, okay, so like as recently as 2 months ago, I'm not even sure I knew who this guy was, and now he's playing and he's doing well, and you know, this is just somebody that Kirby Smart was on that the rest of the SEC was kind of sleeping on, and I guess media guys like me included. And I think that Harrien could still be heard from. You know, he's not as famous as Holyfield. He doesn't have that famous last name, so he sort of gets overlooked in these conversations from time to time. But, y'all, he's pretty good too. Juwan Sith, this is on YouTube, then I'm going to a Facebook after this. Juwan Smith says, what about guys like Robert Beal and Malik Herring? So Herring, I feel like I know more about than Beal. Herring, I think, is ready to really be a big-time contributor this year. I think I'd heard some good things about him by the end of last season. I think we've even had some of that on DawgNation Daily before. So I think Herring's ready to go and be that. And I'm saying Malik Herring, not Brian Harrien, just for clarity's sake. I think Herring is ready to go and be a strong contributor. First of all, he's a great athlete. Just a big, versatile defensive lineman, defensive end type guy. You love what Herring brings to the table. Beal, I haven't heard as much about, although I'm sure there'll be some reporting coming out on that in the very near future. Let me go to Facebook here for a moment, hop on there and say hello to our DawgNation Daily Facebook viewers. It always takes a second. I'm sorry. I didn't have my broadcast up and running. Sorry about that, y'all. Alan Verbanchik says McBride would make a good fullback too. So apparently that's in reference to what Seth Emerson said about Georgia not using the fullback anymore. So I have sort of weird mixed emotions about that. On the one hand, I don't want to see Georgia use a scholarship on a fullback. I'm just being honest with you. But in terms of not ever running like what you might call like a 21 set or a 22 set, 2 backs, 2 tight ends. I don't want to see Georgia get completely away from that. I really don't. I hope that's still a part of Georgia's repertoire. I just think, look, I'm not, in a lot of ways in life, I'm a very old school conservative guy. In football, that's not always necessarily the case, but I do think that the most difficult play in all of football to stop is not that spread stuff you see in the Big 12. It's fullback, it's tailback, it's make them think a running play is coming, play action pass with a smart quarterback who's able to turn his back to a defense, then turn back around and hit open receiver. I mean, you go back and you crunch the numbers. There is no play that consistently racks up yards more than a play action pass does, which means you need to have like sort of traditional football personnel out there in the field. I mean, an offense like New England, they haven't gone away from the fullback all that much. They still run a lot of plays with fullbacks on the field. I don't want to burn a scholarship on one, at least until the guy has stepped up and earned it. But do I want to have fullbacks in the game from time to time? I kind of do. I really do. Mike Johnson says Channing Tindall can be a candidate for the star position. Yeah, he could. I think Mike, and by the way, that's a different Mike than our buddy from the SEC Country Live and who joins us here on DawgNation Daily. Mike, if I had to suggest, though, my suggestion for Channing Tindall would be they have really big plans for him in the sort of Roquan role. Now, I'm not telling you he steps up and plays like a Roquan in his freshman season, but a linebacker who is a true linebacker, I think is probably the way they're looking to go with Channing Tindall for right now. I did think it was interesting. Did you hear Seth mention Walter Grant as a possible star contributor? And by star, I mean the position / nickelback, not the euphemism as superstar type player. I thought that was kind of interesting to think about Walter Grant there in that spot that Lorenzo Carter kind of occupied. We know what's happened to defenses in college football here as of late. Like a star package, extra defensive back, 5 defensive backs in the game is essentially it's base defense now, right? Which means that you're stuck in a situation where you're only playing 2 linebackers. Well, if Lorenzo Carter's your star, you're back to having 3 linebackers in the field again, which just gives you a ton of versatility. And you love those cross-trainable players. I'm not surprised to hear that Walter Grant is potentially capable of doing some of what Lorenzo Carter did. Grant was sort of a weird guy coming out of high school, and I'll give Jeff Santel credit. In the early days of DawgNation Daily, way before a lot of you who watch the show, this is way before many of you had ever even found it. Our podcast audience has a tendency to have been with us a little bit longer, but in the early days of DawgNation, Jeff would be on here all the time saying, y'all watch out for Walter Grant. Watch out for Walter Grant. He's going to be a good player. This is before he was a Georgia commit. This is before any of that. He was down in Cairo, Georgia. I guess the story was, and some of y'all can probably fill in these details a little bit better than I can, but he was, he's not really doing the camp thing all that much. He wasn't that famous of a recruit, but Alabama wanted him, Florida State wanted him, Georgia wanted him. He had the right offers, right? He had the right offers to sort of, suggest that he was a legit prospect, but he wasn't certainly not as famous as Lorenzo Carter was when he came out of high school out of Norcross. But Grant was thought to be a big time weapon, and I think he may prove that a lot this season. I'm very high on Walter Grant. Randy Hall says, why not Charlie Werner as a cross between a fullback tight end, kind of like the H-back role that you hear in the NFL from time to time? That's an interesting idea, Randy. Also on Facebook, Reginald Johnson says, let us not forget there's a player out of school this semester due to medical issues that will return to compete for the star position. So he's obviously making reference to D'Angelo Gibbs, and yeah, I don't count D'Angelo Gibbs out of that spot at all. I think that, D'Angelo was probably hurt a little bit last year by his cousin. If there's no J.R. Reed, maybe there's more room for D'Angelo Gibbs to play. But his cousin J.R. was in there, and he was calling a lot of shots from that defensive back spot a year ago. And now there's that availability, and I mean, y'all can just mark it down now, and we'll talk again in 2 or 3 years. I think Gibbs going to have a very good career at Georgia, and so I would not be surprised at all to see him in the mix there for that discussion. Dre Busey says that dropping back into coverage is going to be one of Walter Grant's strengths. Well, there you go. I look forward to seeing that. Zach Welburn says, BA, think about it. When was the last time Florida got a player that Georgia wanted? Zach, I think that's a very interesting thing to bring up. And, a lot of the Florida folks who watch SEC Country Live think that I'm just like mocking them when I say this, but the truth is I'm trying to help. I'm trying to point out the real solution for Florida. I am shocked at how Florida recruiting has fallen off. I mean, I'm shocked. And frankly, it hasn't gotten that much better under Dan Mullen. And some of y'all know, I mean, that follow this real closely. I'm not going to mention any names, but even some of the 4-star guys that Florida got this past season, even, a 4-star guy from Georgia, for instance. I mean, I'm not going to get too specific because I don't like to be critical of players, but some of y'all know that even 4-star guys from Georgia were not people that Georgia was really recruiting. I mean, it is amazing how Florida's dropped off. They got to commit the other day. Once again, listen, I go out of my way to not be disrespectful to the players who play this game because they put their life on the line every Saturday, no matter what school they go to. But y'all, Florida got to commit the other day from like a guy who's not even like a top 700 player in the country. 700 outside the top 700, and Florida took his commitment. Now, Georgia also took a bunch of commitments last spring that they didn't end up honoring, or whatever, however you want to describe how that all played out. So, who's to say that who's going in classes now ends up being a part of there? But, when Georgia was envious of Florida was getting the top class in the country. Urban Meyer was a recruiting machine. That class he brought in for 2010 may have ended up being, one of the best classes in college football recruiting history. Florida's not recruiting that level right now. And all this sort of, myth making about what a great coach Dan Mullen's going to be, not without players. And right now, Florida doesn't have them. He's not inheriting them. And, so far he's not really making all that many great inroads with the guys who are still out there. Let's watch and see what happens with Florida in a couple of regards. They hosted Frank Ladson, the receiver from down in South Florida, this week. I believe he was a one-time Florida commit. Maybe he's kind of circling back around to the Gators here again. That's a player that I think Georgia would like as a third receiver to that 2019 class. And then there's obviously Trey Sanders, the running back from IMG, whose brother's a preferred walk-on with Florida. Let's see about guys like Ladson and Sanders. Let's see how Florida does with those in-state recruits. But as of right now, it is not great for Florida. You are all right about that. Alan Verbanchik talking about Emory Jones. As of right now, Jones is working as the fourth-string quarterback. And, guys like Kyle Trask, former walk-on, ahead of him. I'm not even sure who that would make the third-string quarterback, but yeah. So it's not been great for him thus far. Junior Baker says, talking about Trey Dean. Now, Dean's going to be an interesting one to watch. That's a guy that could end up having a big impact there. But yeah, so I think the Florida recruiting situation is pretty interesting. Danny Smith says Tennessee's about to boot some guys off. Maybe they can go to Florida and play. I think the comparison between Tennessee and Florida is kind of interesting. Mullen's got experience. Pruitt is an inexperienced head coach, but I think he's overall probably a better recruiter. Now he's got to start winning some of these recruiting battles and doing more than just taking the silver medal. But I think that's pretty interesting to pay attention to there. Let me scroll down and get a few more of the other comments here. Miriam Martin Corbin says, BA, any plans for G-Day yet? So I'm not trying to be so secretive about this. It's just that some of this stuff is still very much up in the air. We will definitely be doing we'll do a post-game show there that day. We'll definitely be doing that. We'll be doing some extra video stuff from inside the stadium on game day too, I believe. We also may have a big pregame thing to unveil, but there is just a lot of sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Things to be tied together that haven't quite been tied together yet. So I hope to be able to talk more about that. But we are sort of maybe a step or two behind on getting all that ready. But if it comes together, it's going to be great. Graham Nicholson says, glad to be back among DawgNation. He was in Europe. He was able to watch a couple times in Europe. That's nice to know. Back at the hotel after a day of exploring, taking time. We're taking the time difference in mind. Well, Graham, we appreciate you checking us out in Europe. I got a tweet yesterday from a guy who had it's become a little bit of a thing on Twitter. People will take pictures of their Gatorade t-shirts or something like that and send them to me from all around the world. We have a lot of service personnel that watch the show. Guy took a picture from the Alamo yesterday holding up his DawgNation shirt. So it was kind of a cool thing to see. So I appreciate y'all taking the show with you when you're out there across the world. Thank you all so much. Al Chandler says he sure wants Jaden Hazelwood. This is on Facebook, by the way. Yeah, to go back to that point that the ESPN writer was making about best offense in college football for the next 3 years, if you look in 2019 and 2020 and say Georgia get the best offense in college football, the number one reason that's going to be true for me is Jaden Hazelwood. With all due respect to Zamir White, with all due respect to either of the two quarterbacks, the addition of Hazelwood is just going to make – I mean, the people who watch film for a living will tell you that Hazelwood's film, in terms of his physicality, in terms of his game-breaking speed, his ability to catch the football, the people who do this for a living love Jaden Hazelwood, and you can't get a better evaluation than that right now. So you add that guy to the mix for a running game that's already stout, an offensive line that's going to be nothing but high 4- and 5-star prospects. If the Georgia offense is great, it's the addition of Hazelwood that's going to make it be so. It's one of the reasons why I'm envious of Alabama, and I don't like saying this. It's not my favorite thing to bring up, but one of the real strengths that Alabama still enjoys for right now, Georgia plays them again in 2018, you're still talking about dealing with Jerry Jeudy and Devontae Smith and Henry Ruggs. Those former 5-star type receivers, when you've got the big running backs, that's just really tough to deal with. It's a really big challenge. Your secondary's got to be able to play some man coverage because you're worried about a running game and things like that. Pretty soon, Georgia's going to have the same thing going on, and it becomes a very, very difficult defense to stop. Very difficult offense to stop. Let me hop back over on YouTube here for a moment. Enrique Murillo, to go back to Frank Ladson, he says, I'm calling it right now. Georgia's going to get the number 1, number 2, and number 3 wide receiver for 2019. That would be an awesome thing to see. That would be a lot of fun. Enrique Murillo, to go back to the star position, says, how about Otis Reese, that star position? And I really think that's your guy. Now, is he in that spot as a freshman? Maybe not. That may be asking for a little bit too much. But supposedly, everybody loves to do the Thomas Davis comparisons with him. Supposedly, that guy who can, hit like a linebacker, run like a safety. That's what Otis Reese is supposed to be. So he may be fun to watch there in that role. Dapper Dan says, how does a team decide which defensive back is going to cover who when playing on those top wide receivers? That's a pretty good question. Am I right about this? That Georgia doesn't really switch receiver sides of the field, right? I mean, DeAndre Baker he's not gonna move from side to side and match up with one receiver, kind of like you do in a basketball situation when you play one-on-one defensive basketball. He's got his side of the field. Typically you're going to put that best defensive back on what you call like the boundary side because it's a shorter throw for the quarterback to make. Therefore, that's the side you expect the quarterback to throw to more often. The field side is, that's the wider side, the longer side of the field. That's where you typically put your somewhat weaker cornerback. It seems like Georgia may sort of approach that maybe a little bit differently than some people do. So really fun stuff there. Juwan Smith, by the way, to finish up on YouTube says, is there any chance we get Andrew Booth in 2019? Well, if you ask Nolan Smith, he says there's more than a chance. He thinks that's something that Georgia needs to do. Check out Jeff Sintel on DawgNation.com. He's been writing a bunch about that as of late. We mentioned baseball a moment ago. Mickey Brady on Facebook says, hey, BA, give a shout-out to Keegan McGovern from Willahoochee, Georgia, and the Diamond Dogs to beat the Aggies today. Yeah, we talked about that during the broadcast. We're going to do a lot of that on our DawgNation Daily Double. I'm actually really excited about Georgia baseball today against Texas A&M. It's actually a kind of a neat day to have baseball back in two regards. Atlanta Braves open their season today at 4 p.m. Diamond Dogs, because of threat of weather, moved their game up from to 5 p.m., so sit on your back porch, watch a little baseball today. You have to pull the Diamond Dogs up on the SEC Network Plus, but yeah, a little baseball today. Looking forward to the Diamond Dogs, trying to stay hot in SEC play here. In fact, let me let you go for now so we can do our daily double. Get that up for you at the forum at forum.dawgnation.com. Check out SEC Country Live 3 p.m. this afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow once again for another episode of Dawg Nation Daily Live. Y'all have a great day.